Imagine waking up one morning to a news alert that the ozone layer, Earth's invisible shield high above us, was completely gone. Not damaged, not thinning, just gone. No warning. No time to prepare. The moment that happens, the entire planet would be exposed to levels of ultraviolet radiation that no living thing is built to handle. What used to be a layer of protection between us and the sun would suddenly become empty space. And from that moment forward, every second spent under the open sky would be dangerous. The ozone layer sits in the stratosphere and absorbs most of the sun's harmful ultraviolet B radiation. Without it, this intense UV radiation would flood the surface of the planet, especially in the daytime and in places closer to the equator. Within the first hour of exposure, people outdoors without protection would start suffering severe sunburns. Within a day, even short periods outside would lead to serious skin damage and raise the risk of skin cancer dramatically. Eyes would be at high risk too, with cataracts and blindness becoming a serious concern even with limited exposure. People would have to stay inside buildings with UV blocking windows or wear full body protection, including face shields, just to walk around during daylight hours. And it wouldn't just affect humans. Animals would suffer too. Livestock exposed to direct sunlight would get burned, and birds and other animals that live outside wouldn't survive long without shelter. Crops like corn, wheat, and soybeans, which feed millions, would begin to die off fast from overexposure to UV light. Plants don't have sunscreen. If this happened during the growing season, entire harvests would be lost. And we're not just talking about farming in one part of the world, this would happen everywhere. From the plains of Kansas to the rice fields of Southeast Asia, the damage would be immediate. Even in the oceans, things would start to break down. The top layer of the ocean, where tiny organisms called phytoplankton live, would take a huge hit. These organisms are the base of the marine food chain and are incredibly sensitive to ultraviolet radiation. If they began to die off, fish and other marine life would start disappearing too. All of this would start happening in just the first few days after the ozone layer vanished. This isn't something that would slowly creep in. The impact would be fast, brutal, and hard to stop. And this is just the beginning. In the next part, we'll look at what happens once the damage starts spreading across cities and countries, and how life on Earth would begin to shift in a matter of days. Within the first week of the ozone layer disappearing, entire cities across the globe would begin to change, not just in how they look, but in how people live. Streets would empty out during the day, schools and offices would close or shift to operating only at night. Outdoor construction projects, farming, sports, and even simple errands like going to the grocery store would become extremely dangerous without full-body UV shielding. Hospitals would be flooded with patients suffering from burns, eye damage, and heat exhaustion. Emergency services wouldn't be able to keep up. Cities like Phoenix, Dallas, and Los Angeles, places already used to hot sun, would be hit hard, but even northern cities like Minneapolis, Toronto, and Berlin wouldn't be spared. This wouldn't be a regional issue. It would be a global crisis. People living in rural areas, especially farmers, would be among the first to feel the impact on food. Within a matter of days, crops would begin to wither and die. The sunlight they need to grow would now be overpowered by ultraviolet rays that fry their leaves and damage their DNA. Entire harvests of corn, soybeans, wheat, lettuce, and fruit trees would be ruined. Greenhouses would become essential, but they wouldn't be able to keep up with the massive demand. In countries like India, China, the United States, and Brazil, food shortages would start to build up fast. And since this problem affects the entire planet at once, there would be no country left to rely on for imports. By the 5th or 6th day, military and government agencies would likely take over essential services in many areas. Public service announcements would run non-stop, urging people to stay indoors during the day and ration food and water. Outdoor areas would be covered in tarps or reflective UV-resistant materials. Solar panels, now overloaded by intense sunlight, could short out or become damaged from the heat and radiation. Power grids already stretched thin in summer months could start failing from the demand of increased air conditioning and emergency power use. Massive blackouts would become more frequent, especially in poorer regions that don't have strong infrastructure. Without power, staying indoors becomes more dangerous, especially in heat waves. Meanwhile, the oceans would begin to shift in a silent but deadly way. Coral reefs in the tropics would start bleaching almost immediately, dying off from radiation stress. Fish populations would decline fast, not just from the death of plankton, but from rising water temperatures and changing currents. Coastal fishing towns in Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa would feel the loss in just a few days. For millions who rely on daily catches to eat, it would be a sudden and terrifying change. Ocean ecosystems would begin to unravel, setting off a chain reaction that scientists would have no way to stop. By the end of the first week, the planet would already be unrecognizable from what it was before. The skies would still look blue, but everything under them would be altered by the invisible radiation now flooding the surface of Earth. And next, things would only get worse. Next, we'll look at how the second wave of damage spreads, how entire ecosystems begin to break down, and what happens when Earth's most basic systems start collapsing. By the end of the second week, the disappearance of the ozone layer would begin triggering deeper, more permanent damage. Entire ecosystems on land and in the oceans would start to collapse. Forests, which normally absorb sunlight and carbon dioxide, would begin to wither. Trees in regions like the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and even the Pacific Northwest would show signs of leaf burn and cellular damage. Without the protective filter of the ozone layer, UV radiation would break down plant DNA at a cellular level. Trees would stop growing, leaves would fall too early, entire forests would go quiet as birds, insects, and mammals either fled or died off. It wouldn't be a slow change, it would be fast, chaotic, and unstoppable. Insects, which are vital to pollination, would vanish in huge numbers. Bees, butterflies, and beetles are highly sensitive to ultraviolet light. Without them, crops and wild plants that depend on pollination would stop reproducing. This includes food sources like apples, almonds, berries, and cucumbers. Within just a few weeks, the global food supply would shrink dramatically. Countries would start enforcing martial law around food production and transportation. What little food survived would be locked down and rationed. Grocery store shelves in major cities like New York, London, Tokyo, and Sao Paulo would be emptied within hours of delivery. As vegetation across continents died, dust and dry soil would take over once green fields. With less plant cover, winds would pick up dry particles and spread them into the air, causing massive dust storms in areas like the Great Plains, Central Australia, and parts of India and North Africa. These storms would not only make the air unbreathable, but would also carry toxins and radiation-baked materials into homes, cities, and water supplies. Respiratory illnesses like asthma and lung infections would rise quickly. Hospitals already overwhelmed from UV injuries would now have to treat people for breathing problems, infections, and starvation. The ice caps and glaciers, already under threat from climate change, would begin to melt even faster. The intense UV radiation would speed up melting across Greenland, Antarctica, and the Arctic. As fresh water poured into the oceans, sea levels would rise faster than ever before. Coastal cities like Miami, Dhaka, and Venice would face flooding within weeks. Combined with extreme heat, UV exposure, and food shortages, some areas would become entirely uninhabitable. Climate refugee numbers would explode. Millions of people would be forced to leave their homes with nowhere safe to go. Meanwhile, the animal kingdom would suffer massive extinctions. Amphibians, already fragile, would be some of the first to vanish. Frogs, salamanders, and toads depend on moist, shaded environments and are extremely vulnerable to radiation. Birds would stop migrating. Many would die in flight from UV damage to their eyes and feathers. Mammals would start to disappear too, not all at once, but in waves. Larger animals like deer, elephants, and bears would struggle to find shelter and food. Within 1 month, the planet would lose thousands of species. The natural world that people have known for thousands of years would begin to fade fast. And this isn't even the full picture. As we wrap up, we'll look at the long-term impacts on civilization itself. What happens when governments collapse, food systems shut down, and human survival is no longer guaranteed. By the second month, without the ozone layer, human society would be in full-scale crisis. Cities that once thrived with light, noise, and movement would fall silent. People would live mostly indoors, with windows blacked out and walls lined with reflective materials to keep the ultraviolet radiation out. Entire communities would become nocturnal, working and moving only at night, but even that wouldn't be safe forever. Food, water, and energy would run low. Communication networks would begin to fail. The internet, radio, and cell towers, overloaded by heat and power shortages, would go dark. Governments would declare states of emergency, but many would collapse under the pressure. In poorer nations, leadership would dissolve entirely as people fought to survive on their own. Nations with advanced technology might try to launch emergency space-based systems to shield parts of the planet, massive mirrors in orbit or high-atmosphere aerosols could be tested to reflect sunlight. But these projects would take years to build, time the world no longer has. Temporary underground shelters would pop up across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. Old Cold War bunkers would be reopened. Some people would flee to mountain caves or deep forests for protection, but most of the population, especially those in cities or low-income areas, would have nowhere to go. Death rates from radiation sickness, starvation, and heat stroke would rise fast. Global population would drop sharply within the first year. Mental health would begin to deteriorate on a wide scale. With no sunlight that's safe, people would suffer from severe vitamin D deficiency and depression. Children born during this period would face developmental problems from both radiation exposure and malnutrition. Medical supplies would run out, and doctors would be forced to choose who lives and who doesn't. Even clean drinking water would be hard to come by as radiation starts to contaminate surface lakes and streams. Boiling wouldn't help. Filters wouldn't be enough. Only deep sealed aquifers would remain safe for a while. Animals that had once adapted alongside humans, pets, livestock, even urban wildlife would die off or go feral. Streets that were once full of dogs and cats would become empty or dangerous. Zoos would shut down, unable to care for animals exposed to deadly light every day. Farms would collapse, even indoor ones, without reliable pollination and power. Some surviving communities might begin hunting again, relying on smaller underground species or stored meat. But it would not last long. By the 1-year mark, the Earth would be a different planet. The skies would still look blue, but the surface would be scorched, silent, and changed forever. Crops, forests, oceans, and wildlife would not recover easily. And humans would face the ultimate question: adapt underground in small, isolated groups or disappear completely. The economic toll by this point would be impossible to measure. Stock markets would have long since collapsed. Trade routes would no longer exist. Currency would be worthless in a world where food and water are all that matter. Nations would stop functioning the way we understand them. A return to tribal, survival-based communities would begin. History, science, art, and culture would be left behind, sacrificed in a desperate race to stay alive. This isn't just a worst-case scenario, it's a reminder of how fragile the balance of Earth really is. The ozone layer, invisible and often forgotten, is one of the thin barriers that makes life on this planet possible. Without it, everything changes, and if we ever lost it completely, there would be no going back.